You mentioned you're back in Germany in between weekends in the US on tour. And when I was reading up about you a little bit, when I knew we were coming to talk, I found an old interview of yours from like a long time ago, 15, 20 years ago, something like that. And the interviewer had asked you, I forget exactly what, but it was one of those kind of standard interview questions of, if you weren't a DJ, what would you be doing? What are your other interests? That kind of thing. And you gave an answer and you said, well, right now I'm very just focused on music, and maybe when I'm 50 and I don't want to travel anymore, maybe then when I'll think about some of those other things. I figured now it might be an interesting time to revisit that, in that you are 50 or somewhere near there, and you're still traveling, still touring. How do you look back at that? I mean, is the touring, the travel, the shows, the music, like, are you still that excited kid in some way?
Well, first of all, I have to say, I obviously got luckier than I thought I would be. So, still having my career going. And yes, I really have to say, I'm just as excited about every single show, about pretty much every single piece of music I'm playing than I was in the beginning. It is somewhat more special now because, I have so much more experience. I have so much more knowledge about music, production, how to play, than, back in the beginning in my kind of like 20s. I obviously, it's like, you go with the flow and you play, and it's kind of like good. It's like now things are more conscious in a way. So, it's like, so I'm looking back, obviously, with a lot of gratefulness, really, more than anything. It's like, for everything that I was allowed to experience, for all the support that I gained throughout my career. And I'm just looking forward to much more to come.
I mean, that's great to hear. It's great that you can still be as excited and be grateful for what already came. I'm sure in your career, you've seen this happen to plenty of people, where people, you just get burnt out at a certain point, or people get overwhelmed, or they get tired. And, or even just that you do it so long that you maybe forget why you started doing it. And it's kind of just the routine of your life at a certain point. So I think it's really awesome to hear you say that. Do you attribute that to anything? The fact that you're able to still sort of really be engaged day to day?
I really think it's like down to the very pure relationship between music and myself. Mm-hmm. When I was a kid, music to me, listening to the radio was like the only gateway to the free world. It's like, I grew up in East Germany, behind the wall in Berlin. And so to me, music has that very, very intense importance. And I always kept that. And that was always what kept me going. That was actually what initially brought me to the point that I, the first time, played in front of people. And it's that same excitement, the same importance that music plays in my life that sort of like still excites me so much about it. And I never came to the point of, let's say, feeling it like a routine. Of course, like all these things, like getting up in the morning, going to the airport, all that sort of stuff, that's part of it. It is somehow a routine because you do it every day. But to me, the essential bit and what drives me is really the momentum. It's, in the moment you start playing, and the thing is, I really care about what I do there. So I kind of think about, how do I start? Yeah. Sort of, how do I lay the groundwork for what is to come? When this unfolds, and then sort of like, everything sort of like moves together and is becoming a set, and you musically with the audience, you become one in the room or the festival or wherever you play. These are such amazing moments that I never get tired of it. And even if it's, let's say, physically tiring, I never forget why I'm doing it.
It's interesting to hear you connect it back to your childhood, growing up in East Berlin. And I think that kind of experience, it's like we're taught about it in history, but I'm sure living through it is a very different thing. for people who maybe can't conceptualize, like being a kid in East Germany at that time, was music an escape? Like, did the world just kind of feel small and music made it feel bigger? Was it that kind of thing?
Well, I can't really speak for anyone else. The thing is, for me, I was lucky enough to grow up in East Berlin, so I was able to listen to the West Berlin radio stations. And that to me was indeed like my connection to the free world. I was as big as a fan of any of the like 80s bands when I was a kid, as anyone else that sort of lived around that time. And I just was never able to either buy a record or read in a magazine anything about them, or basically like go to a concert. That was absolutely impossible. We were on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, as they called it. And so that sort of obviously created that sort of intense wish. I want to be there. I want to see my favorite artist. I want to listen to my favorite music every day, because I either put the record on or the CD, or nowadays, obviously, we have all the streaming formats. And that wasn't possible. So it was something that was very scarce in a way. So it's like it wasn't around, and therefore it became even more desirable in a way.
Yeah, of course. I mean, was music and art and that sort of thing, how tightly was that controlled there? I mean, was it just, it was not available in any form, more or less, other than the fact that you lived close enough to pick up the radio?
Well, they had like an East German record label, and I don't know, they probably released some sort of Western artist, but certainly not the kind of weird stuff that I was into, if you want to call it that. I was a big fan of bands like The Smiths, as an example, or Yazoo, or New Order, or Depeche Mode. So stuff that wasn't necessarily on the political agenda of the socialists in East Germany.
Right. I'm just curious, as a kid, your awareness of the situation, because I'm sure when you're a kid growing up, your life is just your life and you don't necessarily know anything else. Were you aware of sort of the restrictions or the differences in your life from people around the world? Did it feel oppressive?
Well, obviously not in the beginning. Later on, it obviously is like, you become aware of it. It's like, it's like I remember I was 11 years old when like the first single of The Smiths came out, and I was always listening to the radio while I did my homework. And I was just like, wow, this is amazing. So it's like, as a kid, you're just like, okay, where can I see them? Right. Who are they? What's going on? And I was not actually able to do any of these things, and obviously then you ask your mom, hey, what's going on? It's like, oh no, they from the West, we can't go there. And he's like, why can't we go there? It's like, what's going on here? And then obviously, you learn about sort of certain aspects of the life that you actually are living in East Germany. And I also was very fortunate to have a mom that sort of like, she raised me to ask questions, not to take things for the way they are. It's right. Like, so, when somebody told me it's like this, I was like, why? And that obviously kind of led to, let's say, a very interesting dilemma. On one hand, I was very interested in what's going on. On the other hand, I realized, I can't say the word.
You can, I'm here if you want.
What the heck is going on here? So, and that's the thing that's the thing. And then obviously music was a very emotional trigger for all this.
It's fascinating to think about, I think anyone can relate to when you're young, a teenager or preteen. I mean, that is when never does music feel more impactful than at that age, right? Because, you're full of hormones and emotions and you hear the right song and it's, that's what life is all about. But then, to hear it in that context, it's really interesting to think about. Were you musical yourself? Like, were you playing instruments at all growing up? That kind of thing?
Well, I obviously was inspired by my favorite band, so I wanted to play the guitar like Johnny Marr, and I went to some classes, but they made me play like East German sort of child songs.
Right.
I guess that's the reason why I never became really good in playing the guitar. But, I definitely had this very intense interest for the music. And, in the moment, the Berlin Wall went down and I went to Berlin and I saw all the clubs. I was just like totally into whatever was like going on with electronic music. And that's how I found my audible light.
Do you remember the first time you stepped into a club after the fall of the wall, or the first sort of, maybe not even the first club, but just sort of the first like cultural experience you had after that really left an impact on you?
Yes, actually, I do. It's like, as I mentioned a few times, I was listening to the West Berlin radio stations, and they had specialized shows about, like, let's say, the emerging club culture in the beginning of the 90s in West Berlin. So I heard about all the clubs, and there was one club called UFO. And there was like the institution in Europe at the time, I would even say, for electronic music. And that's actually the first place I went to. And it was kind of very, it wasn't like kind of a club or what we now know as clubs or discotheques. It was basically a basement, and you had to kind of go through some door. Then there was kind of a hole in the wall, and you had to go through. And it was just kind of like pitch black and a strobe light and loud, awesome music.
Yeah, it sounds great.
It was just like the purest form of what this music can possibly present it like. It's just like, it was really amazing. And then obviously it's like not much later, it's like, the first sort of bigger in the 90s, they were calling them raves, happened, and I went there and kind of like enjoyed this music on a bigger scale, and developed also my own very sort of, I don't know, unique taste maybe in regards to electronic music, and went on to kind of look for these records or this kind of music in record stores. And because I was the only one kind of looking for that sort of specific kind of driving electronic key, but also with an edge, like, and melodical elements.
Yeah.
Nobody at the time was looking for that in Berlin. So it was actually really interesting for me to find all these things. And, and then started to make my first mixtapes. And one of that actually ended up at the door of the infamous Club Tresor in Berlin. And this is how I got my first chance to actually play in front of people.
For people who don't know, for people who either weren't around back then or haven't done the history, what was the prevalent sound? What was really going on in the Berlin clubs that was maybe not exactly to your taste, but what was popular then?
Well, it was pretty much this whole like Detroit influenced techno, like people like Blake Baxter as an example. They were like kind of like huge. I don't even know if Blake Baxter is actually from Detroit, but it was like this whole thing, which then became, this whole like sound of Detroit in Berlin kind of. So it was all very, in a way, one-dimensional. Not everything, but that was kind of like, say, the core sound of it. And I think also if you listen to what this typical Berlin techno is referencing these days, it still kind of goes back to that.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting too, that for so long, I mean, since the beginning, basically, that Berlin has had that identifiable sound, because I think some major cities, like, the sounds will kind of come and go and evolve and change. Like, it's very interesting to me. And I guess Detroit itself is kind of the same way, where the sound of Detroit techno and what you hear in those clubs, I mean, it's still Detroit techno there. But I never thought about it. I wonder why for some cities they stick with a sound versus, some other cities it'll kind of evolve and change over time.
Because I think it's like, maybe one of it could be totally wrong, but maybe one of the reasons is because they become a destination for that sound.
That's true.
So instead of actually the sound moving towards different cities where it's being played and kind of sticks, people actually from all over the world actually travel to Detroit to hear that. People from all over the world travel to Berlin to hear that particular sound. So if then suddenly in Berlin something else would be played, people obviously would be disappointed because
Right.
they're not actually getting what they traveled for.
Yeah, that makes
And
total sense.
I think that might be the reason.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. That's a bit, I didn't even think of it. You're right. And for you, I mean, it sounds like you wanted to get involved, to be doing it yourself pretty quickly once you had the ability. How did you learn how to DJ in the first place?
Actually, I didn't want to do it at all. I didn't really want to become a DJ. I had a very different prospect. I wanted, first is like in East Germany, I started an apprenticeship as you probably would call it a broadcast technician.
Okay.
And then obviously it's like we left East Germany, that job didn't really exist in the format that I learned. And then I wanted to become a carpenter because I thought, that's something I can do. I can sort of somehow do something.
Sure.
And I just, as I said, I fell in love with electronic music, and I made those tapes just for myself and some friends. And one of the tapes actually ended up at the door of Tresor, and this is how I got the chance to play. But obviously, when I played for the first time in front of people, I was like, okay, yes, that's it.
Right.
And then I wanted to kind of like, do it as good as I can. And the thing is, like in the beginning, I didn't even have like turntables because I didn't have money. And so I went to like a flea market and I bought some sort of like some construction that was an old dual turntable. It didn't even have a case.
Okay.
So since I made an apprenticeship as a carpenter, I built myself a case around it actually to be able to mix from a tape onto the record and the other way around. So I learned with very, let's say, limited equipment.
Right.
And that actually kind of then when I was able to use the famous Technics turntables, it was kind of easy for me to do the technical stuff. So it's like, beat matching came rather easy to me then. And a lot of other things are simply also down to being very lucky and be at the right moment in the right time, really.
And did you pretty quickly also start trying to make the music, to produce?
Not really. The thing is, because it was quite quickly kind of like, looking back, but like it wasn't my intention really. It was more like that because I played so different than anyone else. It's like, obviously some people heard, oh, have you heard this Paul guy? It's like, he's doing this and he's doing that. And because of that, I, started doing my first sort of interviews, and other people kind of like introduced me to other musicians and producers. And this is how I ended up for the first time in a studio and actually doing something. It was obviously very, very rural in a way, kind of like doing like this and trying to kind of get some notes together, and then learn which of the black and the white ones sort of like sound good together, that sort of stuff. It was a very limited approach in the beginning, but I always had a very clear idea about what I want to do. And then I started learning exactly that. And I had like a phenomenal, first co-producer mentor. His name is Johnny Klimek. I learned so much from him in regards to producing music, making music. And, I'm forever grateful for that too. But I never stopped. I never sort of thought, okay, cool, this is like, the moment to be. I always wanted to kind of, I heard something and I wanted to know how to make it. I always wanted to kind of actually present electronic music in the best possible way there is. And at the same time, I had my very own idea how electronic music should sound.
Yeah, it's so interesting to hear you say that, that it wasn't even necessarily the intention at the start. It was just something that you did as a passion, as a personal thing that then sort of just snowballed out of control and turned into a professional thing. I mean, that's very interesting. And I wonder if some of that, like your background as the broadcast technician apprenticeship or working as a carpenter, both of which have to do with sort of getting inside something, the component pieces of it. Do you think any of that, or maybe just the way your mind works, what appeals to you about it, is part of why you present the music the way you do? Because I think even your live shows where you're playing, live piano and looping it and cutting up sections on the fly, all of that, it goes a bit beyond the sort of standard DJ set, especially in the modern era.
Everything is obviously kind of like sort of shaped me as a person and therefore as an artist. And so there's probably some reason why I do what I do in a certain way, but I would just kind of like make it much simpler. I just wanted to have like full control over the music that's actually like coming out. And, I remember in the late 90s, as I said, beat matching was rather easy for me. So it's like, there was like an 8-9 minute track.
Right.
And you were just like wondering, what am I doing now? And this when I started taking the first sort of reverbs and echoes on stage and so on, and try to kind of like get more and more involved in how the music comes across. And then obviously when the first real lifetime sequencer came in, when it was possible to take a computer on stage, I did all that because it simply enables me to be far more creative and far more interactive than actually waiting for 9 minutes of a record to be over.
Yeah, I mean, that makes total sense. And yeah, that's a good point too, that especially, I mean, DJing itself has changed to a certain extent, like the 8-9 minute track thing in general. I feel like that was so much more prevalent in the 90s than it is now. I mean, some certain genres, certain DJs, you still see people do it, but I think quick mixing or like you do, finding other ways to sort of keep it interesting is much more of a thing now. I think people were doing it a lot less back then.
Yeah, I was certainly like trying to keep it interesting, even though it was a 9 minute record. But I also think I really have to say it's like, it is also the quality of a good DJ to know when a record should run longer. That's as much as cutting it shorter for impact. And that's something that sort of sometimes, especially when we had around 2013, 2015, all this kind of EDM hick hacks kind of thing, where there was like track for 30 seconds and then something else, and you didn't really have the chance to enjoy any of it.
Right.
I think it is really about actually feeling the music and then go with it. And whenever you feel there needs to be an impact, there needs to be a point where you say, yes, you have to play that point. And my technology is allowing me to do exactly that. I don't have to wait for it to actually come up sometime, some point in the record. I can just play it.
Right. It makes me wonder too, like, if you came up and you took some good early guitar lessons that didn't really stick, that kind of thing, how did you, like, I just watched a video of you playing live piano over a song, and I go back and I listen to a song, like a hit song like For an Angel or something, which has such a strong sense of melody and such an identifiable, like, catchy line. Like, where did your sense of melody and harmony and being able to compose like that come from?
I really think all the base of that is in my childhood, when I was listening to the radio, when I was listening to phenomenal composers like Johnny Marr and Morrissey, someone like Martin Legore from Depeche Mode. If you hear even something that comes across, so let's say simple, it's so complex and it's so in itself, every single note is an artful, crafted little dot. It's just phenomenal. And I really think it's like, the melodic side of me is really what sort of obviously was shaped at the time. And then the reason why I combine this with a drive is because I'm just like someone who's like always has something to do. It's like, I can't sit still. So I my grandma used to say I have bees in my ass. So I'm simply someone who's, I like the energy. I like the power. I like the jumping as much as I like the musicality of things. And I really think the foundation of that is really has been put into me, into my head, into my artistical soul when I was a kid listening to those artists.
Well, I have to imagine too that there's a lot of discipline in you as well, or at least a lot of energy to just learn all of that, right? If you didn't have someone teaching you, how to play the piano, or what chord, what notes make up a chord, or what a progression is, all of that. Early on, were you spending a lot of time figuring that out, or was that just something that kind of came along as you were getting more and more into the music?
I seems to always have had an ear for kind of like melodies and things like this. But yes, I always also had kind of like the energy of, I want to know how this works. I want to know how this whole thing actually works out, and how some things actually, as an example, there's a very thin line between a really cheesy melody and a really classy melody. Mm. And obviously, this is always down to subjective observation too.
Right.
But it is something that I just like always took a lot of, care that what I do, regardless of in what sort of like form or shape it kind of appears to be, that there's something about it that is sort of unique in its own way. At least that's what I always tried, and in the end, sometimes it works better than other times. When I look back at my, my catalog, there are also a few things that I probably would do very different these days. But that's what I mean. That's, it's part of actually like becoming more mature and growing up.
Sure, yeah, and maybe that's a good way to talk a little bit about what you're doing right now. Obviously, you're on some off days for this off the record tour, but the tour in general is sort of meant to be, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe it's meant to be sort of a preview of the album projects you've got coming up. Which is another interesting sort of delineation between styles of music and sort of perspectives on music. For the people who don't know, I guess, can you give sort of a brief summary of what the off-the-record concept is?
Well, the thing is actually, it's part of an even bigger concept. It's like, at the end of the day, we're releasing the record. This is what it's called in the end, but it's going to come out in like 3 phases. The first phase is called Off the Record. And, we all got stuck home during the pandemic. So did I. And, my inspiration is always like, whatever I experience, whatever I see. So suddenly I was stuck at home and looking out of the window, seeing the very same tree every day. So the hectic life that was my source of inspiration suddenly just became the hectic in my head. So the music turned out to be somewhat different, and it turned out to be a little bit more, I don't know, I don't want to really kind of like put any sort of like, genres, but more like techno orientated, sure. More like on as much as I think trance is very progressive, but more on the sort of like proggy way.
Yeah.
And that's why I thought, calling it Off the Record is actually quite a good title, because, as it's a terminology from journalism, when basically it's like, switch the tape recorder off and you talk to real stuff, right. Something that's actually not actually meant for the masses. And this is what I did. That was music I essentially just like did for myself in this sort of time of, I don't know, weirdness for all of us, really, because suddenly time stood still. It's like, we weren't allowed to sort of see each other, travel or whatnot, where all those lockdowns. And so this is actually the music that you will find on Off the Record, and then is For the Record. At the same time, I have those bees in my ass and I am energetic. And so it's like, and on For the Record, you will find those tracks that you hear me play at festivals, and the energy that sort of is the essential drive of the majority of my sets. And then the record is an accumulation of all that in even more music. So it has been a very intense way of releasing music. It has to be very interesting for me as an artist. Also maybe somewhat challenging to my audience, because obviously suddenly they heard a track that was only 126 BPM fast rather than 138.
Right.
And it was like far deeper and darker and had, instead of, let's say, a catchy hook, just like this intense string arrangement as a break and things like this, just like a different approach to the same intensity of the music.
I want to ask too, how do you take a project like that on tour? How are you approaching these live shows?
Well, it's like, it is very sort of like an approach towards what I expect the audience to be. Let me explain this. Obviously, it's like when I play in a venue that is traditionally kind of known as, okay, this is very trancey, very upward, then obviously I'm not necessarily kind of playing kind of like a deeper techie set or something, but I will incorporate these sounds. And now we're coming back to my setup. It enables me to do so. I can, simply because it's not a final version or track or whatsoever, I have all the production files there. I can play a straightforward trance anthem-like version of like a really deep track of mine, because I can just kind of redo things on the fly. And the same way around, it's like, one of my Up in the Air track, I can kind of make them kind of like deeper and darker in a way to fit another approach. At the end of the day, it's always, I have a very clear idea about the general sound and things and the music that I want to bring across. As I said before, I take a lot of time to think of how do I start, how do I build. And then everything else is always down to the interaction with the audience, and you will see, it's like, how does it stick what I'm just doing, or is it maybe something that I, in my sphere, in my cosmos, can change and accommodate somehow.
Do you think about, when you're sitting down to write a song, do you think about the audience? Do you think about the dance floor? Does that come into it while you're writing?
Very rarely. That's more when I produce it. It's like, when I write it, it's more about actually kind of just like, I don't know, letting go, just like be with myself and play around and play chords, play melodies. And then the next step is sort of, it's like you put like, oh, it could be good with a sequence here. And then you try, it's like, hey, it sounds even better if you slow it down. And this is when you think, okay, it could be in that context. It could be in that context. And then let's say the aspect of thinking about the audience, is more kind of a production element rather than composing.
Well, this is something I ask a lot of people. What's the most fun part of it for you? What do you really get excited about doing still? Is it the finding the spark of an idea in the studio? Is it sort of crafting it once the idea is there? Is it playing it out? Is it the travel? Like, what do you really get excited about still?
In my particular case, it's the combination of it all. Because the thing is, obviously having an idea is like kind of hearing something that has existed only in your head before. And then suddenly kind of like, it sounds, it's phenomenal. But also playing it out is phenomenal. And it all kind of inspires each other somehow. It's like, I'm pretty sure that my music and the way how I compose music is totally inspired by what I see every weekend in clubs and on festivals, as much as in the other ways, like the way how I produce is obviously also influenced about that too. So it's kind of like this whole combination. The only thing that, let's say, is not my favorite part of it, I always call it the process of traveling.
Of course.
This whole check-in procedure, like pretty much everything that has to do with airports and security measurements and all that. That's not necessarily my favorite element of it, but everything else that has to do with music and the audience is just like something that it belongs together for me. So I wouldn't really want to take
that's a really good way.
apart.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And you're right. Obviously, it's the combination and when it all comes together, those are the really valuable moments. It is, this is just a side note, but it is kind of amazing to me with the travel thing too, how it's still, it just keeps getting worse. Like everybody knows like airplane, it's not that fun to go through an airport, that kind of thing. But sort of amazing that they keep finding ways to make it less comfortable and less pleasant. You know what I mean?
Look, at the end of the day, it's like, we have to all make sure that we are all safe up there and around aircrafts and stuff. And so therefore, I understand that it's actually happening. But on the other hand, we should be further with the technology at airports to kind of get everyone through quicker. I mean, there are airports where you don't have to take your computers out because they have machines and it just goes through, and on the end, takes like 2 minutes, it's just like the whole process. And that's obviously something, you wish you would see on more airports.
This is just me complaining now, but, in the US, I mean, you can get the TSA pre-clearance, which means you don't have to take out your computer. And now I'm sure you've seen, there's also the clear thing, which is sort of a different level of security, but it's kind of just capitalism at this point. Like, it's just like you pay a certain level and that'll determine how much you can. It's totally bizarre to me. But
tell you one thing, it's like, after this, let's say the pandemic, sort of the lockdowns dimmed out and the first shows were happening, I was so happy to be back on a plane, and I didn't even bother complaining about the screaming baby behind me. I was just happy to be. And I think it's like, when we focus on that, in a way, how our life suddenly stood still and there wasn't any, let's say, exchange. It's like my wife and myself, we have friends all over the world, and suddenly we couldn't see each other anymore. It was just via Zoom.
Yeah.
And so, then being back on a plane, going to see your friends, going to kind of play music for an audience that you have missed so much. That was like the greatest thing. And I don't really care about the screaming baby at that point. I just hope it's going to be fine.
Talking about how your perspective changed during the pandemic and you were writing some different styles or different sounds. I wonder too, like we were talking earlier about that sort of mid-2010s EDM era. And over the course of your whole career, how much do you pay attention to sort of the trends going on around you in dance music? Because I think you've been remarkably consistent. Not that you haven't evolved and tried different things and learned and changed, but I think there's sort of an aesthetic, a certain sonic signature that can tie together a lot of your work from early on up until now even. So it makes me wonder, like, have you paid attention to the trends? Have they affected the choices you make at all?
Well, not from an artist perspective. Of course, as a music lover, I'm interested to see what's going on here and there, and I'm listening to this and that. But my art form is the music that I make. And the thing is, making something completely different that is not connected to it would be really weird to me.
Yeah.
I have a certain way of enjoying music, and this is what you sort of hear when I make music as well, And the thing is, as well, this is why, when it became so important to kind of put everything into, okay, this is this subgenre, this is this subgenre, and so on. It was kind of really weird to me because I'm playing in my set as much kind of like upfront banging techno to banging trance to melodic deeper things to whatever. It really depends on the moment, because this is what it's all about. And what he said, it's true. It has kind of like a sonic element that combines it. And that why it works, why you can play like a Keith Cannell track as much as a Paul Van Dyke track together in one set without it kind of falling apart, as I said, because it has the dynamic, it has the drive. So from straightforward in-your-face techno to something that maybe even has a vocal and that kind of like picks you at your heart, it can work. And I don't know. That's at least what I'm trying. It's like to kind of bring this across, because electronic music is so rich and so vivid and so amazing. To just pigeonhole on one little element, it's like, I think it's a waste of creativity, to be honest.
Was it a weird time, in the mid to late 90s when you're really blowing up and there's a ton of eyes on you more than ever before, and you kind of caught that trance label? Because I think, there's some other people doing sort of what we would now call trance music at the time, and it was sort of this wave. Was it odd at the time to be sort of lumped into that when it wasn't necessarily something you yourself were claiming?
Well, the thing is, I never really cared that much about it, to be really honest. It was more others that kind of like, oh, this is like, trance this Paul, trance that Paul. At the same time, if you listen to something like For an Angel, it's a very, very different trance track, if you want to call it that way. It doesn't have kind of the 16 sequence. It doesn't have the kind of the bass line. It just kind of like has this like little groovy off the hook, actually off higher than the hook line and the melody. So a track that most people actually started to noticing me with is not necessarily a stereotype trance track at all, despite the fact that it became one of the trance anthems. But it's just like where people put a label on. But what I find more, let's say, disturbing somehow is, you're labeled with something, and then your artistical integrity or creativity is measured by the popularity of that genre.
Yeah,
which is something that is kind of difficult, and it's like, I remember when in the sort of like mid 2000s, techno was like the most uncool crap, and then like some of the people that I kind of admire were kind of suddenly totally uncool DJs. Interestingly enough, now they're really cool again, and sort of people who, let's say, are affiliated with trance music are not so cool, despite the fact we all come from the same source, the creativity of electronic music and all the facets this music provides. And I think we would kind of come back to that understanding of it, and not just kind of, oh, I like kind of like backwards loops in a drum and bass beat, but only in A minor. It's just like, it's about us being humans and expressing ourselves. And if this is done in a creative, respectful way, then you have the most amazing evening with electronic music, regardless of what genre.
How did you find fame around that time in general? Because, if I think back to like the, For an Angel, and then many, maybe the next 10 years or so, I mean, you were, I think it's fair to say, one of the biggest DJs on the planet for a long period of time. And I think that is an experience that most people haven't had. I think it's a weird one. I think fame in general is sort of an odd thing. What was your experience of that? Like, did you enjoy parts of it? Did you struggle with parts of it? Did it affect you creatively, negatively, positively? Like, if you look back at it now?
I think there are a few aspects for it. It's like, one is obviously, as I mentioned before, it's like I always knew exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing. And if nobody would listen to my music, I would still make that music. That's what I do. I didn't really care much about like, how famous or not famous, I was, have been, or am. Because, my mom always kind of like also like raised me to kind of like see the real thing, what's like really important in the world. And, as much as it is great when people come up to you and sort of say, oh, you're so amazing and you're a legend and whatsoever. I'm very much aware if they go the next day to someone else and tell the same thing to another DJ. So
that's right.
It's like I can put this in perspective. They obviously also have very sort of like, heartwarming like moments and experiences when people really had a story of their life attached to my music or to an event where I was playing and so on. But these are more intimate moments, and these people are usually, I wouldn't even call them fans, because fan is like, to me, is like screaming kids out on the street while, I don't know, a boy band is in a hotel or something. they are people who really kind of took something from my music and incorporated it into their life. And this is something this is when I'm, as an artist, when I'm really, really proud and happy, because a lot of people, they always ask me, say, what makes electronic music so special? And I always say, a good piece of electronic music becomes your own soundtrack, because it just sketches something for you, and you have to fill it with your own energy, your own identity, and then it becomes yours. And when this is happening and people have an emotional, personal story, then and I get to hear them.
Yeah.
Then this is something where I have tears in my eyes, where I am really moved, rather than somebody coming up and say, "Oh, you're such a legend." Because, as I said, it's I know the same person is most likely going to stand in front of the next legend an hour later at a festival, or a day later in a club.
Yeah, you're right. And it's, I think, a good point about the soundtrack concept. I talk about that sometimes on here, that, we can all think of memories, important moments in our life when music soundtracked some really impactful or really memorable moments in our lives. I wonder what you make of a song like For an Angel, looking back on it now, which was not only a hit song, but I think, and not only a soundtrack for a lot of people, it was almost like a soundtrack to a decade. Like, it was, that song, I think people who don't listen to electronic music still know that song. I think culturally, it kind of reached a point where it's just a soundtrack to sort of an era of time culturally. And I wonder, I mean, how do you look back on that song just in general, but also, what is it about that song? Like, do you have any theory about sort of how that happened?
Well, first of all, I have no idea how that happened. I didn't even want it to be released as a single, to be honest. It came out on my very first album, the first time in '94. And because in the UK, my second album came first, and then so basically they were released reversed. So suddenly they needed a single for the record, and they said, "Well, why don't we take For an Angel?" And I said, "No, I don't really want to. It's kind of 4 years old, And so it's why don't you make a new version? So I made a new version, and this is actually the version that a lot of people know about. On the other hand, I think what my feelings towards this track is now, it's almost irrelevant, simply because of the fact, as you just said, it's to so many people, it kind of I don't know, it was either the first track they heard in regards to electronic music, or something at the moment that was important to them. I'm pretty sure there are a lot of people who also hate it a lot. So it's so it doesn't really has, I don't know. I can just tell you from a production point of view, I did this after one of my first visits to Los Angeles, and I had some studio time booked. And I actually did a track that's also my very first album, called A Magical Moment.
Okay.
And apparently, sort of, For an Angel was kind of a production spin-off of A Magical Moment in a way. It's I had still this hook line going on that didn't fit A Magical Moment anymore. So it became its own track. And maybe because it was so unintended, maybe that's why it became so, I don't know, fresh, at the same time accessible to a lot of people.
Well, that's such a cool story, and such a good note for any producers who might be listening to this too, is that, there are other choices you could have made in that moment, right? Like you could have tried to sort of shoehorn it in to the first song in some way, or you could have said, well, it just doesn't fit with this song, so we'll just forget about this little piece and focus on the main thing. But because you made the choice to separate it and just say, well, we'll finish this one thing, and then this little idea is kind of cool on its own, let's look at that later, that it became what it was. I mean, it's those tiny little choices that you make in the studio just one day. It's kind of amazing the ripple effects they can have,
Absolutely. But I have to say, it's without let's say, the creative guidance, the technical guidance of Johnny Climate back then in the studio, I wouldn't have been even able to kind of like, develop that creative freedom in my head actually to kind of do so. So I'm thankful to kind of like a lot of things that sort of like happened, and also to the people that sort of like taught me a lot.
There's so many milestones and so many interesting stories. I think it's sort of impossible to talk about them all. One that was on my mind just because this year's Grammys just got announced was that you were nominated for the first ever, correct me if I'm wrong, electronic dance Grammys, like the first time that was a category, right?
Yeah.
Did that feel, what was that at the time? Did it feel like a big deal, or did it just seem like kind of an odd thing at the time?
Well, again, it's like, I always do and did whatever I did because I love music. So it's like an award is always an honor, but that's seriously not why I'm doing this. And it never has been. And the Grammys are super duper special. There's no question about it. But every single smile and every single handshake after a set, when somebody said that was awesome, means a hell of a lot more to me. So yes, it was great when it was kind of, established, but I felt more, finally, electronic music is recognized as a musical art form by the Grammys. Because before it's like, the common sense was, it's just like the stuff the computer makes the music. And obviously it took a lot of convincing from a lot of electronic artists and DJ to talk to the people that sort of like run the Grammys, to actually tell them, no, it's not. We are actually artists. We just use different instruments. A computer is nothing more than a modern 8-track tape machine, just with more tracks, but it's only playing back what you put in as an artist before.
Right. I mean, it's kind of incredible just people forget, I think, how it wasn't that long ago that it was like this. I mean, the first time dance music had a category at the Grammys when you were nominated, it was what, 2003 or 2005, somewhere in there. Not that long ago in the grand scheme of things.
No. Yeah. I mean, the thing is as well, but I'm not the kind of guy who says like, everything was like good in the past. But there's like one thing I really kind of like about let's say my musical career is, the thing is, I kind of like got into this world of music when this music wasn't around. Whatever we wanted to hear, we actually had to make.
Yeah.
But that also gave us the freedom to do whatever we wanted to do. So now obviously things are far more formatted, certain sort of ways, and 8-bar patterns and all this kind of stuff. So there's like, it's good that it's recognized, but there's also kind of like fell into the, like, let's say, trap of the music industry somehow.
Yeah.
And that's what I said before. It's like, if we kind of get away from this genre tapping, kind of like, oh, this is cool, this is not cool, and just go actually what's actually good and driving on an objective as much as on a subjective level, I think this would be kind of the next milestone in the development of electronic music, the whole genre.
Yeah. Well, and that actually ties into the next thing I wanted to ask you, talking about something going from underground to mainstream, and, maybe some of the origins or the intentions being lost along the way. I wanted to ask you about the Politics of Dancing compilations that you put together, and kind of more broadly about the idea of maybe partying with a message, if you want to call it that, or, in putting politics, putting real life issues into sort of, what is, this communal dance, euphoric experience. Because I think it's something that is missing a bit to me in the modern era of dance music. But to me, I think there's still room to include politics and message. But I wanted to ask you, as someone who's been doing it the whole way, just what your view on that whole thing is.
Well, I think I would give kind of like a 3-part answer. Number one is, I don't think that you necessarily lose the passion, the power, the real thing when something goes from underground to commercial. It kind of leaves the impression, because suddenly it's not these individual artists who started the thing that are in the spotlight. It's suddenly marketing teams, it's suddenly management teams, and people are grouping people together somehow. And somebody is just like put in the front, this is DJ so and so because has a nice face, or whatsoever. Yeah. So it's like, the musicality in itself is not so much important anymore, but that's the driving sales aspect. This is when something goes underground to commercial, but it doesn't necessarily mean that if you dig underneath the first level pop, you find exactly that intense, amazing music. In regards to, let's say, political things, first of all, the politics of dancing came about. It was right at the time when they actually were shutting down all the clubs in New York, and there was like a lot of problems and so on. And I wanted to make people aware of that. This is a youth culture. This is a culture that unites people from all over the world, regardless of what passport they have, what God they believe in, what color they might have on their skin, whatsoever. It does not matter at all. We're all just human. We are respectful and tolerant with each other, and we love that music, and we're coming together to celebrate life. And this in itself is a political aspect of life. And this is what I wanted to bring across, and this is why I called this compilation The Politics of Dancing. Now, in regards to political engagement, I think there's a time and a place for everything. I honestly wouldn't necessarily go to a festival and, let's say, have political phrases throughout my set, because that's not what this is all about. I think what it is all about, we should be all kind of very conscious citizens in our democracies, and to know that a democratic system is only as good as people are getting involved. Now, here comes the aspect number 3. It's like giving people an amazing positive time. They take that smile, they take that energy back into their everyday life. And with that smile, they can make a change. And this is when there's a political element to it that you can give. At the same time, I would not necessarily kind of, take the microphone and scream some political message.
Well, I mean, that's a hell of an answer. And I love you basically making the point that when we all come together to dance, that's political in and of itself, I mean, this is fascinating, man. I could talk to you all day, but I'm going to try to wrap it up here. As we're kind of getting towards the end of it, is there anything else we haven't talked about? Anything else you want to get out there? Anything I should have asked you? Anything else about the new music that we should talk about?
Well, the thing is, I'm obviously living my life. I'm in my artist bubble, so I don't really know what somebody may or may not find interesting about my life. As I said, I just hope that people wouldn't sort of like pigeonhole artists into some genre and whatnot, and then have an opinion without giving these artists a chance. Like, because I can tell you from my own experience as a music lover, whenever I went to a DJ that I did not have on my list, whenever I went to a band that I did not have on my list, I was just probably more blown away because I didn't have that expectation. Unless actually going to kind of, okay, here I know exactly what I'm going to get. This is awesome. This is great. But as a music lover, it's also about discovering new things. And there's like so much music out there. And, never would I have imagined myself totally like falling into like, stuff that someone like Niklas Paschberg is doing. It's just kind of really floaty piano-based music with a very modern electronic twist to it. If my wife wouldn't have said, we're going to go to that concert, I would have never really experienced that artist. And this is the thing. And that goes from like, I mentioned Keith Canal before. He's like one of the guys from the proper techno world that really sort of like inspires me in regards to, not that I would do the same music or something, but there's so much drive in it. There's so much life in it. And this is something I would have, if I would just gone to the same trance festivals, every day, I would have never heard him. And this is an enrichment in your everyday sort of musical experience. And this is what I wish I could encourage people to do, kind of like, find music. And then, you like it or you don't like it, but, at least somehow it's also the chase for that. And it doesn't even have to be the latest news whatsoever. It's just the chase for that one beautiful piece of music that you will essentially find, and it will define your life for that moment. And this is when it becomes absolutely unbelievable.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I talk a lot about the idea of nostalgia and memory on this show. And we talked earlier about how, you always have these memories tied to music in your past. But I think you're right that it's such a beautiful idea that we don't have to necessarily get stuck in that nostalgia, that, we can have a million more of those moments in all of our lives as long as we keep looking, stay open to it. I mean, is that part of what keeps you here, that excitement? Like, I think about even running your own label, finding new artists. Is that still a big fun to you, a big part of the excitement?
Look, absolutely. I mean, we just really launched a sub-label, and I called it purposely. We called it Vended Alternative, because it confuses people. Because to some people, alternative is obviously kind of like a rock subgenre. To me, alternative, I take it as it is. It's an alternative. It's the same quality of music. It's the same intention to bring something artistically across, but it's in a bit of a different format. It's not 138 BPM festival sounding. It is somewhat deeper. This chase to find this music, to kind of hear something that I haven't heard before. This is the excitement about it all. And this is what drives me as an artist, as a DJ, as someone who kind of like makes a radio show. This is sort of like, I think when you're a real music lover, then this is just kind of a normal thing.
No, and it's so cool, man, that you're still expanding the label and still trying new ideas. It's, I think you're practicing what you're preaching here, and that's pretty fun. I guess kind of to just wrap it up, I felt like we should just tell a couple stories, just some fun kind of light stuff, because I think in your career, you've had experiences that not a lot of people have had. And okay, so this is not the shitty interview question of what's the craziest show you've ever played, but is there a show or maybe a few shows that you just think about a lot, that for whatever reason, whether it was good or bad or weird, that just kind of pop into your head from time to time?
I'm doing this for such a long time. I had so many incredible moments. It's really difficult to pick. It's really more about like certain, let's say, times of electronic music, and therefore my career. It's like, that sort of, there were like moments. I remember, like the beginning in Berlin at places like The Planet or eWork, and then how, the PA, because, now it's obviously all like digital stuff. Like back then they were like real kind of, let's say, physical speaker where, like the whole technology behind it. And it's like, you could hear when a DJ actually started to warm up the PA. This is how sensitive the sound was at eWork, as an example. So you really started kind of just with wobbling bass and soft bass drums and stuff. And then the PA was warm. And so these sort of like, very geeky things. Obviously, places like Gatecrasher in the UK, absolutely phenomenal. And, playing at Twilo in New York, and, having like 5 blocks, people queuing around to get in. And this is the things like, then later on, obviously, we did Central Park shows. And I also, the other day, I saw one of the Fallen Angel music videos, and they were actually there's video footage of me playing in downtown LA with 25,000 people in front of me. And that was all before social media. That was all before TikTok. And it's like, hey, look how great I am. There was simply the people and a few musicians bringing across what this music means to us. And these obviously are very essential moments and very sort of special moments. But I can also say it's like, that the last show I played was very special and very important. We did every single thing is part of what I'm musically about. And so therefore I'm looking back with a big smile on my face, and I'm looking forward with a big smile on my face.
I love that, man. And I think another part of this too, and you tell me if you agree, is the people you do it with and the people around you. And, if you like thinking back to the early days, whether it's, early in Berlin or whether it's when, the trance era in the mid 90s, were there people you felt like you were doing it with? Either other DJs that felt like your peers or just people you talked to a lot as you were having these experiences? Like who was around you? Who was in your circle at this time?
Well, of course, like, a lot of guys like from the Frankfurt scene. There was like another DJ from Berlin, Kid Paul, I played a lot with, and like, DJ Doug, Sven Feth, and, we were like all together, Mark Spoon, who obviously is not with us anymore, but these were people that were, let's say, my musical surrounding. But I would say that this community was even bigger because, as I mentioned, electronic music, it wasn't like it is now. It wasn't everywhere. There wasn't you couldn't switch on the radio and hear some electronic sounds. You couldn't switch on the television and there's some kind of electronic beats playing. You had to search for it. And every single person who was kind of like into that music became a friend simply because we had the same love for that weird sounding crap. and this is when it became like really special. I remember standing in the metro in Berlin, actually kind of like, and having back then the Walkman on, really loud and listening to some like techno beats, and somebody came in, and because the headphones were really badly isolated, unfortunately, the whole train actually could listen to what I was listening to. And a guy came in and said like, he was immediately my best friend for the day, simply because he was obviously knowing about this music. It was a different sort of community feeling in a way. But look, that's the beginnings of probably any sort of art form or music genre or whatsoever. It's like, that heartfelt early love that then develops into passion, into this real long-lasting, ever-growing craziness in your head and your heart and your soul and love for that music.
I agree. And I think I'm relating to what you're saying on multiple levels. For me, and I've said this on the show before, music, when I started making music, when I started playing music, connecting with people that way, it made me feel more seen. It made me feel like I was expressing myself in a way that maybe I couldn't with words, or that maybe it was a more true reflection of myself. I don't know if it was the same for you, but I think what we're talking about here is that when you make a connection with people on those other levels, on beyond just sort of talking to them in a day-to-day life, that's kind of the most meaningful connections we can make at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, music is a very emotional thing that sort of combines emotion and energy in a very unique way. And if you connect on that level, then obviously it's a very energetic and very emotional connection to whoever is kind of like enjoying it as much. And as I said, it's like there's so much to discover, and there's probably so much I'm missing out on because you cannot really listen to everything that comes out. But if you try, you will always find something that's exciting.
Well, I love that, man. And I really enjoyed this conversation. I have one final question I'm going to ask you. It's the last question I ask at the end of each one of these interviews. And I think it connects to a lot of what we're talking about. Just looking for a moment from your life, a single memory from your life. It could be from any time, could be from when you're a kid, could be from last week, doesn't matter. Just a moment when in that memory, it's kind of the soundtrack thing. Just a memory where music really deeply impacted you in that moment, really meant something to you. That could mean gave you goosebumps, made you cry, soundtracked a happy moment. Doesn't have to be the best one, doesn't have to be the most important one, kind of just the first one you think of.
Depeche Mode, Somebody.
What about it? When did you hear it?
Well, it's obviously is a song that I sort of like, knew for a very long time. One of the best pieces that Martin, who's the main songwriter, obviously of Depeche Mode, ever written. But I also, I had this like rather bad accident in 2016, and sort of like, I was like in coma and then switching in and out of coma, and luckily enough, my now wife, then girlfriend, she was like with me at all times. And the doctors actually said that most likely I won't be able to remember who I am, who she is, what I'm doing, what not. So she had the most amazing idea in decorating my hospital room with things that sort of, remind me of who I am. And what she did, whenever I just blinked with an eye, slipping out of coma, she was singing me that song.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it always will be a most important, special song for me. And then when we, 1.5 years later, when we got married, like that was also our first dance.
Oh, man, that's what an incredible story. The accident is certainly something I remember when that happened. I remember reading about it, and I'm so glad that you're here with us, man, and still making this music and all of that. And the fact that you can point to music and family being sort of the things that got you out of it, I think is also, I think it ties into everything we've been talking about, man. That's a really beautiful story. And I'm glad you're still here doing it, man. I'm glad. I think your excitement for it is infectious. And thank you for taking the time to talk to me, man. This was really nice.
Thank you for having me.
That's it. I'll let you go. Thank you, man. Have a great day. I really appreciate it.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.